This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
As the Government of Canada works to make Canada a world-leading centre for innovation, we're keenly aware of the relationship between intellectual property rights and innovation. In many ways, intellectual property can be thought of as one of the currencies of the modern economy. So we know that putting in place the right policy framework is essential for supporting inventors and creators who wish to bring their ideas and products to market. We also know that it is our role as a government to help these folks by creating more good, well-paying jobs, which will in turn strengthen and grow the Canadian economy, and in particular the Canadian middle class. The truth is that Canada's IP regime is robust and amongst the top IP regimes internationally.
In recent years, we've seen a growing effort to link long-standing concerns about Canadian innovation with patents. The argument, which has crossed into Canada's strategy around artificial intelligence, posits that the road to an innovative economy is inextricably linked to a greater emphasis on intellectual property and in particular on patents. Want more Shopifys? Direct your policy towards more patents, goes the story. But what if the correlation between patents and innovation is weak at best? What if an emphasis on patents may actually be harmful to startups whose attention and resources is better placed elsewhere? Peter Carrescia is a successful innovator and investor who recently wrote a Globe and Mail op-ed that raises precisely these issues. The co-founder of Key Identity, a Toronto-based company focused on decentralized identity solutions, and a veteran of companies such as IBM, Microsoft, and OMERS Ventures, he argued that, and I'll quote, "creating policy that pushes patents, regardless of area or company stage, and gauges success by counting patents is misguided and in fact dangerous to the success of startups." He joins me on the podcast to talk about his experience and concerns with direction of government policy that may be mistaking an IP policy for an innovation one. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
And thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you on. You know, in keeping with the Law Bites title, this podcast is pretty lawyer and legal academic heavy, but I'm always delighted to welcome a broader range of perspectives and have had politicians and business people, entertainers and others come on the podcast. You bring years of experience from the venture and technology world. And what prompted this episode of the podcast was an op-ed that you published earlier this month in the Globe and Mail on patents, and your take that we've seen too much emphasis on patents as a means to solve Canada's innovation problems. I want to get to that piece and some of your concerns and ideas. But before we do that, why don't we start with your background? Can you highlight a little bit your career path?
Sure. I started in tech, or my interest in tech started when I got my first computer back in the early 80s as a kid, and started developing software. So then I took the path of going to the University of Waterloo, comp sci. On graduating, I worked at a software company called Lotus Development, which some of your older listeners may still be familiar with. It was not a car company. We were acquired by IBM in 1995. Was there for a couple more years, and then moved to Microsoft. And then in 2000, I was recruited into a VC firm as a partner focused on enterprise software, and that was based here in Toronto. And worked and invested mostly in enterprise software companies in Canada. And then in 2010 was recruited to help start up OMERS Ventures as a managing director. I hired out the initial team there, made the first investments, and also created the first investment thesis to guide those investments. Was there for a couple of years, and then moved on to run to be the president of Next Canada, which is a national technology accelerator with programs like Next 36 and Next AI. And then in 2016, a founder that I was quite close to, a company I led the seed investment round in when I was at OMERS, asked me to join them as they were starting to scale their business, and that was a company called at the time Wave Accounting, and then their name changed to Wave Financial. So I joined there as the head of strategy, biz dev, and corp dev. Was involved in negotiating equity investments and partnership agreements with Royal Bank of Canada, ADP, the payroll company, equity investments by global banks like National Australia Bank, Power Corporation invested. And then in 2019, we sold the company to H&R Block for, at the time, it was $540 million exit. And then I was planning on kind of semi-retiring then. That this was early 2000, and then unfortunately COVID hit. So my travel plans were kind of cut short, and I ended up was asked to join Information Venture Partners, which is a Toronto-based fintech VC firm where I've known the founding partners for many years. And I joined them as a venture partner, focused on helping them on due diligence on new opportunities, as well as their existing portfolio company. And then most recently, mid last year, Kirk, the co-founder CEO of Wave, was transitioning out of H&R Block, and he and I started discussing ideas around how we could work together again. And out of that came a company that we co-founded mid last year called Key Identity, focused on decentralized identity technologies. We announced in August an $8.5 million seed round. And right now we're hard at work getting a product out to market in the next few months.
Okay, so as a super interesting career path, obviously a really successful one, and certainly you've been involved in sort of a remarkably wide range of perspectives when it comes to innovation and the funding that exists. Out of all of that, I didn't hear a whole lot of focus on policy. Doesn't sound like that's really been your beat. So what was it that prompted you to write the op-ed in the Globe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm normally a behind the scenes kind of person. Certainly, over the last few years, there's been a small but pretty vocal group of people that have been talking about patents and their importance in a way that simply didn't jive with my experiences, and recognize, my experiences have been very, very focused on, early stage startups, almost exclusively software companies. And so it didn't really bother me because it didn't really have an impact on me. But then recently there have started being, those voices have started influencing and impacting policy at a governmental level. And so there was really kind of two triggering events recently that kind of made me say, listen, I've got to get my voice out there. And my voice, I've got lots of VC friends and successful entrepreneurs that are all in agreement with many of the things that I think here. So the first thing is that I am on an investment committee for a seed fund, and there was a startup that we were working with looking to put a small amount of money into. We're talking like $100,000, so not a lot of money. And they were very, very focused on, from a use of proceeds perspective, using some of that money to file a patent. And that's when I realized that these voices are starting to impact the startups in a way that is actually detrimental to their success. And then really the last straw was there was an article in the Globe a month or two ago about artificial intelligence and patents. And the subsequent commentary on Twitter about that, which really then made me say, listen, I got to get my voice out there on this.
Okay, I mean, it's interesting. I do recall that Globe piece. It was, I believe, part of a series that had a strong emphasis that linked patents and innovation. Now, your response argues that the evidence suggests that the links to patents, particularly startup success, I mean, it's notable that that's where you've put in a lot of your emphasis, is scant at best. That there's not a lot of evidence there. Can you expand a bit?
Yeah, I mean, and my concerns here are entirely based on the evidence that I've seen, and I'm always willing to take more evidence in and reevaluate my opinions. Now, the important thing to kind of lay out at the beginning, and which I did highlight in my op-ed, was that I am focused here. My concerns are specifically focused on software patents. This is kind of where my experience lies, and I do think there are different facts when you start moving outside of that to physical products and materials and chemistry and things like that. My background, as I've kind of mentioned, I've literally been involved in hundreds of software companies over the years, and not even once, has a patent ever made a difference to any of these companies. Not once. And that doesn't mean that sometimes they could make a difference, because there are cases that I know of that I was not necessarily involved in where they have made a difference, but it's very, very rare that they do make a difference. And there's a number of examples that you can give, like prominent examples that everybody's aware of. I mean, there's Shopify. Shopify and Toby has been quite vocal about IP and specifically patents and how important they've been to his business, or how unimportant they have been. I mean, here's a company that scaled from, they really started scaling in 2008 through the 2015, 18, 20, and literally had not one core patent that you could point to that drove that success. But I also find, far more interesting is that, in 2008, e-commerce was a pretty well-known and researched and commercialized area of business. I mean, there was Amazon and eBay, and then service providers to these markets like IBM and Oracle, and literally thousands and thousands and thousands of e-commerce patents that had been laid out before Shopify rose to prominence. And literally not one of them was able to stop Shopify's growth. Doesn't that kind of point to the ineffectiveness of a software patent? How is it possible that Shopify was able to navigate all of this and be as successful as they were, essentially become the dominant e-commerce software provider in the world? And so there's an example of one company that didn't use patents to get there. Now look at the other end of the spectrum. IBM, which is like the 800-pound gorilla in patents. They've literally been the number one filer of U.S. patents for 25, 30 years now. I think last year they lost the title. And in just the last few years have filed over 3,600 patents in the area of artificial intelligence. And yet, over the last 12, 15 years, their market cap has declined by 50%. Revenue has declined by 50%. I mean, everybody remembers the term Watson, but who's talking about Watson today? Everybody's talking about OpenAI and ChatGPT and Google and Facebook's AI initiatives. So where did that get IBM? I could throw in another Canadian example. I mean, if you look at RIM and BlackBerry, back in the 2000s, they were patenting over, they were filing over 600 U.S. patents annually. And yet, and that covered all aspects of a smartphone, including the software. And yet, despite that, Apple was able to rise to dominance. And then right behind them was Google with Android. Like, how did patents not help BlackBerry protect the franchise that they had created? And maybe I have no idea if Apple or Google had to license patents from BlackBerry, but if they did, that revenue is immaterial and didn't stop BlackBerry's decline as a dominant player in the smartphone market.
Yeah, no, those are some pretty compelling examples, to be sure. The Shopify one in particular, I think, rings true and seems highly relevant, because my recollection from the piece that you're talking about in the Globe was that the argument was we need more Shopifys in Canada.
Yeah.
And then in the next sentence says we need more patenting in Canada, in effect. And I think the point you're making is that, Shopify in many respects is an illustration of how patents are not necessarily the be all and end all when it comes to innovation and commercial success in that space. Given that these kinds of examples that you're able to cite, why do you think we've seen this significant emphasis, some coming from the private sector and now increasingly adopted within government, around patents, as if it's the secret sauce that will solve what I think is widely recognized as an innovation problem in Canada?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I have some theories. Certainly, there's been a number of influential individuals that have been beating on this drum for a while, for whatever reasons, and they seem to be getting traction now on some of their concerns. I think, it's easy also to, kind of wrap the flag around this thing too. And, I hear this thing about protect Canadian IP. And, honestly, I have no idea what Canadian IP even means. Is that that it was, created by a Canadian citizen, that it was created by a Canadian company that frankly was, has 60% shareholders that are Americans? Like, I have no idea what Canadian IP even means. And then I think also, and this is, I don't fault people for this, because I think, people want to be able to measure things, and innovation is an incredibly hard thing to measure. And so, I think it's easy for policymakers to latch on to something that you can count. And so be able to point to that and say, listen, the dollars we're spending are actually generating real value, because, last year we had this number of patents filed and this year we have this many. But it really doesn't go the next mile, which is kind of like, and what was the value that patent generated for Canada? There should almost be some kind of an analysis called the return on patent value, or I don't know what, but something where you can say, this is the value that patent has created over time, whether it's jobs or revenue or the ability to build a moat around the company to allow them to continue to operate successfully and ward off competitors.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you make that point in terms of that desire, certainly for something to measure, and that notion of what counts as Canadian. There are echoes of that in a lot of different digital policies right now. We're seeing the same thing arise in the context of culture and what counts as a Canadian film. We had a whole series of Canadian winners at the Oscars, none of whom were in films that were technically CanCon. And, those issues are, seem to pop up in a lot of places where we want to ensure that there's a Canadian presence and Canadian success, but how we determine even what counts as Canadian can be difficult. Now, I noted in the piece, you really do distinguish a little bit between some of the big companies and the smaller companies. Can you talk a bit about, because you're certainly not anti-patent, you do talk about how big companies appear to use patents for defensive purposes, for example, but you're obviously much more cautious about the patent emphasis for startups. Can you explain a little bit why companies at different stages in their lives might be looking at patents in different ways? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, so part of my opinions on this are based on what I see and what I read, as opposed to my personal experiences. And it's been a long time since I've worked at Microsoft and IBM. But what it seems like is that, large companies start to accumulate patents, whether they develop those patents on their own or whether they buy, patent portfolios from other companies. They seem to do it as a way to protect themselves from competitors. And frankly, I mean, if you look, recently Shopify has started doing a bit of this too, despite what Toby has said about his thoughts around patents. And in one way, it feels like it's almost, there's almost a bit of like deterrence by way of mutually assured destruction. It's like if company A sues company B, company B will go through their portfolio of patents and find these companies often have hundreds, if not thousands, of different products, and many of them competitive with each other in some way. So then company B will go through their list of patents and say, okay, well, we can make, we can countersue on these 4 patents for this product. And we don't know exactly if they are infringing or not, but we'll throw a lawsuit back at them. And now it almost becomes less about whether you're actually infringing, and just the cost of litigation is so high that they basically just say, okay, well, let's just cross-license these portfolios to each other and call it a day. And that seems to be how it works. It's almost like an insurance policy you're getting to use should somebody sue you. You have an ability to sue them back. And then, now everybody's kind of at a standstill.
Yeah, you do certainly hear a lot about that from a defensive perspective and how these patents can be used. Turning to the startup side, because you've been active in that space, trying to incubate and develop these kinds of companies. What do you see as the problems if they are focusing on patents, and what do you recommend to those companies that they should be emphasizing or focusing on?
Yeah. So, the first problem I would kind of is, I would almost kind of classify it as a resource allocation problem. So, you're a startup, and the reality is patents are expensive. Now, if you're a big company, you're thinking, what do you mean? A patent only costs us $30,000, and $30,000 isn't a lot of money, and maybe it's $20,000, maybe it's $40,000. Ballpark, that's kind of the price. And for a startup that's only raised, say, $1 million of seed funding, $30,000 is a lot of money. But it's also, and more important than the direct costs of getting a patent, is the time and focus of literally probably the most important people in your business. The person who would have developed that idea is probably your top engineer or one of your co-founders. And now you need to take those couple of people, put them in rooms for a number of meetings with a patent agent, with lawyers, exchange emails, review documents, draft documents. That's a lot of time you're spending when really you should be working on your product, talking with your early beta customers, iterating the product. You typically probably at that stage only have 3 or 5 or 10 key people, engineers or designers or product people. And now you're tying them up for maybe 20% of their time for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And that may not sound like a lot of time, but when you only have 6 months of runway, that's a lot of time. When instead you should be trying to get some indication from customers that you have product market fit, because that is why an investor invests in you, not because you go in and say, I have a provisional patent on this one process in my software. And that VC is going to say to you, well, that's great, but I don't even, there's no evidence your customer even wants that software yet. Really, at that point, everybody in the company should be focused on getting feedback and iterating the product. A good example of this is, most of us have probably used Instagram. Most of us have probably not used Bourbon. Bourbon was actually the first version of Instagram. That came out in 2009. At that time, if you recall, a product called Foursquare, which was like this check-in app where you could check in that you were at your Starbucks or at a hockey game or something like that. That is what Instagram was originally. For the first year, they raised $500,000 of seed funding on that idea, and they got no traction. Imagine if they had to, like 3 months in or 6 months in, if they had written a patent on what they were doing. That patent would have had no relevance to what that product ultimately ended up becoming. And that it would have been wasted money and time on that. And that kind of leads me to the second problem, which is a bit of it's a little bit softer, this challenge, but I do think, I've seen it and I do think it's a real problem. if you've ever done, self-help or career success courses, they'll always tell you one of the biggest pieces of advice they'll give you is write it down. Write down your goals. Only if you write them down will you commit to them, and you can look at them every day, every week, and see how are you tracking to that progress. Well, you can draw a line from that to what happens if you actually decide to go get an early patent. Codifying those ideas into a patent, while some may think is a good idea, actually has the effect of hardening people to that path. And it makes it harder later to pivot to something that is entirely different. I've seen that happen. The engineers who aren't necessarily savvy enough, they kind of think, well, this is what we're working on now. And it becomes harder for them to think about throwing away code that may have codified what is in that patent, because they think, well, that's what this company is about.
That's a super interesting example. I mean, it suggests that in some ways patents actually can constrain the innovation process, that you stop innovating a little bit because you feel that's the recipe that you've identified for the innovation, and that can really harm at the end of the day what your final output actually looks like.
100%. And I'll, a follow on to that is, this is something that's kind of unique to software because software can be so iterative. It's not like a hard product where you've got months of design and then you got to go get a prototype casted or printed or something like that, or developed and then you got to test it, and then you got to, and especially when you're talking about SaaS software, your customers are using it. You are often pushing changes online while customers are using the product 2-3 times a day. So you can, it's so incredibly iterative. I mean, the one example that I kind of use when I talk about software and patents, is this idea, the analogy, and it's kind of maybe it's a poor analogy, but it works for me as to how I think about it in my mind is, if I lived in Vancouver and I wanted to drive to Burnaby, I would put in my Google Maps that I want to go to Burnaby. And it would give me a route and I'd be driving. If I veered off of that route, Google Maps will recalculate a new route. And there are, essentially, literally many different ways for me to get from Vancouver to Burnaby, different roads, lots of different ways to get there. And so I can get to point B in really an unbelievable lots of different ways. And if you're kind of stuck going down one path and then that path is closed, how do you get there? And that's one of the challenges. And in fact, it kind of also then ties into where patents and software could work. Because imagine now if I'm in Vancouver and I want to go to Victoria and I say I got to take my car. Well, now I have a constraint of only being able to take the ferry across. And so where in software you can see a situation where there is only one way to get there, well, then maybe in that scenario, it's a good idea to patent. But those are often very, very rare situations.
Okay. Some great examples. Why don't we close with this? You've identified some of the downsides and the risks, especially for those that are still at a very early stage of the innovative process and are trying to build the companies of becoming overly reliant or focused on patents. Yeah. But we know, as you talked about earlier, the government has increasingly been focused either as a metric or embedding it within their policy. How do we get to if the destination that we're focused on from a policy perspective is to enhance and increase the level of innovation in the country? What would be your policy prescription for dealing with some of Canada's innovation problems? How do we pivot away from this emphasis and focus that we've seen over the last little bit on patents as sort of one of the key focal points?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue. One thing I can say, having worked with VCs around the world and being involved in companies in different parts of the world is literally every industrialized country in the world thinks they have an innovation problem. I've even read papers about regions in the US that think they have an innovation problem because they're all comparing themselves to Silicon Valley. So first, the problem may not be as great as we think it is. I do think there are challenges, but Canada does still get its fair share of winners. So let's keep that in mind. But I look at startups really as the main driver of innovation in our country, and ultimately that results in jobs and hopefully Canadian prosperity. And really, so anything you can do to help move along startups, and I think of startups as I like to try to think of it as a funnel. So at the very top, you start with super bright people with great ideas, and how do you kind of match those ideas? Maybe it's through a university, maybe not. Maybe it's just individuals that have come up with the ideas on their own. How do you match them with the right team of people, with the dollars they need to kind of push things along? And then, then the company kind of falls down the funnel a little bit more. So, how can government provide assistance to the next stage of company around commercialization of their early customer wins? So, and you kind of go all the way down to, eventually, hopefully the company is large and starting to scale. So now how do you help them with export opportunities and selling globally? And so that's where I think government should be focused. And, there's lots of different areas that could be tweaked. But, I think that is a much, that's much more fruitful, and you're going to get better results if that's where people are focused.
Okay. Well, Peter, it's not clear that the government's been hearing that perspective so far. We know what the focus has been. It's reflected in some of the policies, but it's pretty clear that I think policymakers would do well to be listening, quite frankly, to the people who are actively engaged in that community, who have seen what works and at times what doesn't work, and begin to craft some of their policies in that direction. And so grateful for you taking the time to walk through some of your experiences and for you choosing to speak out on some of these issues. It's something that doesn't get enough attention. Thanks for doing that. And thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.